The year is 404 BC. Athens is in its death throes. 27 years of the Peloponnesian War have bled the city dry, leaving behind a scorched earth. The treasury is empty. A generation of men lies buried, and the spirit of the people is broken. The great city-state has been crushed, its total humiliation only a matter of time. The ultimate act of humiliation was the destruction of the long walls. To the sound of flutes and the triumphant cheers of the Spartans, the symbol of former Athenian power crumbled. This fratricidal slaughter ended not just in military defeat, but in a deep moral blow, a disgrace etched in stone and in the souls of the Athenians, a sign of the final collapse of their world. The city's economic heart had stopped. The once bustling port of Piraeus fell into a deafening silence, where the creak of boats and the cries of birds replaced the sight of hundreds of ships. Trade ground to a halt. Democracy, crushed under the boot of the Spartan garrison, gave way to the rule of an oligarchic committee of 30. The city sank into stagnation. The rule of the oligarchs, known to history as the 30 tyrants, was brief but bloody. Backed by Spartan swords, they plunged Athens into an abyss of terror. Denunciations, exiles, property confiscations, and summary executions became routine. Yesterday's neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and fear became the city's highest law. In this oppressive atmosphere, a young aristocrat of the equestrian class named Xenophon, son of Gryllus of the Deme Urcia, wandered the streets. He was about 25 years old. He was part of a world that was collapsing before his eyes, and he saw how mistrust and despair had saturated every stone of his native city. What prospects could an ambitious aristocrat have in a ruined city-state? His background aroused suspicion, and the ideals he was raised on had been trampled by the war's outcome. In the agora, he saw the poverty of veterans, the heroes of past battles. At 25, when ambition burns brightest, his future had been erased. He felt keenly how the glory of Athens was turning to dust. Raised on the great examples of Marathon and Salamis, he had trained his body for battle and his mind to comprehend great deeds. But now, his reality had become an unbearable prison. He had nowhere to apply his strength and knowledge. His world had been razed to the ground. The career as a politician and general that was his birthright had vanished with the smoke of burned Athenian ships. The paths that once seemed obvious had disappeared. But at the same time, far to the east, in the vast Persian Empire, a new conflict was brewing, a distant whirlwind that would change everything. This whirlwind was destined to draw in thousands of desperate Greeks left without purpose after the war. Among them would be Xenophon. He did not yet know that an incredible journey into the heart of enemy territory, betrayal, and a desperate march home thousands of miles long awaited him. He was destined to transform from an aristocrat philosopher into a leader saving 10,000 lives. His name would be immortalized not by the sword, but by the pen. But for now, he was just wandering the streets of a fallen city, listening to his teacher Socrates, and asking himself, "Where can I find my path when all the old roads lead nowhere?" The answer would come later, in the form of a letter from Asia. For now, it is worth noting that Xenophon was born around 430 BC into a wealthy family. His father, Gryllus, belonged to the nobility, which secured the young man a place in the highest class and the prestigious equestrian order. Fate was preparing him for great things. Belonging to the elite defined his entire way of life. From a young age, he was trained in horsemanship, weaponry, and gymnastics, He was prepared for the role of a defender and leader of the great city-state. The future seemed clear, predestined, and full of glorious deeds in the service of a prosperous and powerful Athens. His childhood coincided with the peak of the city's power, the golden age of Pericles. The treasury was overflowing with tribute from allies, and Athenian democracy was considered a model. He grew up on stories of great victories over the Persians and witnessed the construction of the Parthenon, a symbol of his homeland's greatness. He grew up in an era of prosperity. But this idol was merely a facade. When Xenophon was still a child, in 431 BC, the devastating Peloponnesian War began. This conflict pitted Athens and its maritime empire against Sparta and its land-based alliance, plunging Greece into chaos. It was a total war of attrition, unlike the short conflicts of the past. It lasted for nearly 3 decades. Xenophon came of age to the accompaniment of news from the front, stories of sieges, the devastation of Attica's lands, and endless political intrigue. The war was the backdrop to his entire upbringing. The situation was worsened by a terrible plague that claimed up to 1/3 of Athens' population, including the great Pericles himself. His death in 429 opened the way for irresponsible demagogues and adventurers whose risky decisions only hastened the city's fall. The political system was degrading. Before his eyes, democracy was turning into the rule of the mob, ochlocracy, where decisions were made under the influence of emotion, not reason. Upon reaching adulthood, he, as befitting an equestrian, took part in the final, most desperate campaigns of that long and grueling war. Service in the cavalry, the elite of the Athenian army, gave him priceless combat experience. Patrolling, reconnaissance, covering the heavy hoplite infantry, it was all dangerous but prestigious work. In battle, he learned to control his horse in the heat of the fight, to quickly assess the terrain, and to make life or death decisions. The war hardened him, but it also filled his soul with bitterness. He saw the price of a human life and the fickle nature of military fortune. He witnessed how the incompetence of generals and the populist decisions of the assembly in Athens led to the senseless deaths of thousands of soldiers on the battlefield. The culmination of the tragedy was the catastrophic Sicilian expedition from 415 to 413. A huge army and fleet sent to conquer Sicily were completely annihilated. This venture consumed colossal resources and sealed the outcome of the war. For Xenophon and his circle of aristocratic youth, this disaster was the final proof of the destructiveness of democracy. They leaned more and more towards oligarchic ideas, dreaming of a stable rule by the best men on the Spartan model, which would protect the city-state from the madness of the crowd. Defeat in 404 became inevitable. Having received Persian gold, Sparta built a fleet and, at the Battle of Aegospotami, destroyed the last of the Athenian forces. A blockade by land and sea finished the job. Famine forced the once great city to capitulate. Defeat was preordained. After the surrender, the brutal oligarchic junta of the 30 tyrants seized power in Athens. It was led by Critias, a former student of Socrates who had become his antithesis. The regime sought to rebuild the state on the Spartan model, relying on violence and the physical elimination of all dissenters. For moderate aristocrats like Xenophon, it was a time of difficult choices. He accepted neither the extremes of democracy nor the bloody terror of the tyrants. He found himself caught between a rock and a hard place, while many of his acquaintances either joined the tyrants or became their victims. Most likely, he tried to stay out of politics, But in that world, neutrality was almost impossible. The old values, honor, loyalty, justice, had been trampled. The young and vigorous cavalryman found himself out of place in a city that had turned into a place of fear and despair. His aristocratic background and combat skills made him suspicious to everyone. Athens was forbidden to have a large army, and his experience became useless. The Democrats, who would soon overthrow the tyrants, saw him as an enemy. But the tyrants themselves trusted no one. He was an outsider to all. It was this feeling of complete hopelessness, the collapse of all life's guideposts, that forced Xenophon to seek an application for his talents beyond Attica. He began to look for a place where an educated and skilled Greek could find a new purpose and prove himself. He decided to seek his fortune abroad. But against the backdrop of this political catastrophe, intellectual life in Athens continued to thrive. Its unofficial center was the philosopher Socrates. He wrote no books, had no formal school, and took no payment for his conversations. He simply talked with people, and these conversations changed their lives. Socrates held his dialogues on the streets, in the markets, and in the gymnasiums, and his listeners were people of all classes. The young Xenophon was captivated by his personality and method. This encounter became a defining event for him, shaping his moral compass and philosophical views for the rest of his life. The pulsating heart of the city was the Athenian agora, not just a market, but the center of public life. And amidst this noise and bustle, Socrates would appear, a short, stocky, and plain man resembling a Silenus. His unattractive appearance contrasted sharply with the greatness of his mind. His method was simple and devastating. He could stop a self-assured politician and begin asking him simple questions about justice or courage. Under this barrage of questions, his interlocutor would become lost, his confidence would melt away, and in the end, he would be forced to admit his own ignorance. For Xenophon, who was familiar with the sophists, paid teachers of wisdom who taught the art of argument for the sake of success, Socrates' method was a revelation. The sophists claimed that truth was relative. Socrates, however, sought truth, starting with the admission of his own ignorance. I know only that I know nothing. Socrates' goal was not argument, but a joint search for truth. Meutics, the art of midwifing knowledge. Unlike Plato, who was drawn to metaphysical heights, Xenophon, as a practical man, was more interested in his teacher's applied ethics, his views on real life. In these conversations, he sought answers to questions about how to become a good citizen, commander, or friend. The key idea he absorbed was that virtue, or arete, is knowledge. A person commits evil not out of ill will, but only out of ignorance, not knowing what the true good is. The central idea that Xenophon would carry throughout his life was enkratia, self-control, mastery over one's own passions. A true leader, Socrates taught, must first learn to control himself. He who cannot control his anger, greed, or fear cannot lead others. This idea of self-control, as the foundation of leadership, would become a leitmotif in all his future works, from the Cyropedia to the Anabasis. In the latter, as the leader of a huge army, he would put into practice the lessons learned from his great teacher on the streets of Athens. The conversations with Socrates took place against the backdrop of a deep crisis. Xenophon saw how democracy brought ignorant demagogues to power, and his teacher's criticism of this system resonated deeply with him. The philosopher questioned the very foundations of the Athenian order. Why, Socrates would ask, Do we call an experienced carpenter to build a ship, but entrust the governance of the state, a far more complex matter, to random people chosen by lot? These ideas, placing knowledge above eloquence, were very popular among the disillusioned aristocratic youth. But such criticism was dangerous. In the eyes of many Athenians, Socrates appeared to be a subverter of foundations, a corrupter of youth, and an atheist. His reputation was also tarnished by his association with such odious figures as Alcibiades and the tyrant Critias, although the philosopher himself never approved of their actions. Socrates was becoming an enemy to many. After the restoration of democracy in 403, the Athenians were looking for someone to blame for their misfortunes. In 399, Socrates was officially charged and sentenced to death. At this time, Xenophon was already far away in Asia, in the very heart of the Persian Empire. The news of his teacher's execution was a terrible blow to Xenophon. It finally confirmed his worst fears about Athenian democracy. The city he was supposed to protect had killed the wisest of men. This event forever changed his attitude towards his homeland and predetermined his destiny. It was the execution of Socrates that became one of the reasons for his long years of exile and service to the Spartans, the enemies of Athens. To protect his teacher's memory from slander, he would later write several Socratic works, such as Memorabilia and Apology, creating in them an image of a wise and practical mentor. In these works, he sought to prove that Socrates did not corrupt the youth, but on the contrary, made them better. He wanted to show the world that his teacher instilled in his students piety, moderation, and true civic virtue, rather than preparing tyrants and traitors. The lessons learned in the Agora became Xenophon's inner core for his entire life. And while Athens was recovering from the war, a storm was brewing in the Achaemenid Persian Empire. In 404 BC, King Darius II died, and a fierce struggle for the throne began between his sons. The elder son, Arsaces, was appointed heir, ascending the throne as Artaxerxes II. But he had a younger brother named Cyrus, the favorite of their mother, Queen Parysatis. These two were complete opposites, and their rivalry was to plunge the empire into civil war. Artaxerxes was indecisive and cautious, preferring palace intrigues to battlefields. Cyrus, on the other hand, was young, energetic, charismatic, and incredibly ambitious. During his father's lifetime, he had been appointed satrap of vast territories in Asia Minor and commander-in-chief of all local forces. In his post, Cyrus proved to be a talented administrator and commander. Unlike many Persian nobles, he was straightforward, kept his word, and generously rewarded loyal service. He developed particularly close relations with the Greeks, and during the Peloponnesian War, he supplied Sparta with money. Having become closely acquainted with Greek warriors, he highly valued their combat qualities, especially the discipline and invincibility of the hoplite phalanx. He realized that this was the force he needed to realize his secret plan, to seize the Persian throne. The Greeks were the key to his plan. Cyrus believed that the throne rightfully belonged to him, as he was born when his father was already king, unlike Artaxerxes. Relying on this formality and his indomitable will, he began to secretly prepare a rebellion to take power from his older brother by force. Immediately after Artaxerxes' coronation, the satrap Tissaphernes, a rival of Cyrus, informed on him. The plot was exposed, and Cyrus was arrested. But their mother, Queen Parysatis, pleaded with the king for forgiveness for her younger son. Cyrus was not only released but also returned to his satrapy. This was a fatal mistake by Artaxerxes. Returning to his capital, Sardis, the insulted Cyrus began to act more cunningly. With even greater determination, he resumed preparations for the rebellion, but now in secret. Under the pretext of fighting mountain tribes and border disputes with Tissaphernes, he began to assemble a huge army. The core of this army was to be Greek mercenaries, misthopheroi. After the end of the Peloponnesian War, thousands of professional soldiers throughout Greece were left without work. Hardened in battle, they knew only how to fight and were ready to serve anyone who paid well. Possessing immense wealth, Cyrus was the ideal employer for them. Recruitment was carried out through trusted agents throughout Greece. One such recruiter was Proxenus of Boeotia, an old friend of Xenophon. It was he, already in the service of Cyrus, who wrote the letter that changed the fate of the Athenian aristocrat. In the letter, Proxenus did not reveal the true purpose of the campaign. He only described the brilliant opportunities at the court of the Persian prince, calling Cyrus a generous patron and a great friend of the Hellenes. He promised Xenophon not just wealth, but a friendship with Cyrus himself, which, he said, was more valuable than one's homeland. For Xenophon, who saw no future in Athens, this offer sounded like an answer to his prayers. The idea of traveling to distant Asia, testing himself, and gaining fame and fortune was incredibly attractive. It was a chance to start a new life, to break free from the suffocating atmosphere of the fallen city. However, as a cautious and pious man, he did not make the decision immediately. He went to Socrates for advice. The philosopher, understanding the risks of serving the Persians, the long-standing enemies of Athens, advised Xenophon to consult the oracle of Apollo at Delphi and ask the will of the gods. But Xenophon, already seized by a thirst for adventure, was crafty. Instead of asking whether he should go, he asked to which gods he should offer sacrifices for a successful journey. Having received an answer from the Pythia, he returned to Socrates. The philosopher rebuked him for his cunning, but said that since the will of the gods was clear, it must be followed. Having secured divine approval, in the spring of 401 BC, Xenophon left Athens. He went to Sardis not as a mercenary, but as a civilian observer, a guest of his friend Proxenus. He wanted to get to know Cyrus first before committing himself. He did not yet know that this path would lead him thousands of miles deep into a foreign land. He had no idea that he would become a participant in a grand military drama on the banks of the Euphrates, and that his return home would become one of the greatest feats in history, immortalizing his name and the names of his 10,000 comrades. In the spring of 401, Sardis, the capital of Lydia, was buzzing with unprecedented activity. Detachments of mercenaries flocked here from all over the Greek world: Spartans, Arcadians, Achaeans, Boeotians. These were professional soldiers, the flower of Hellenic soldiery, ready for new battles. It was officially announced that Cyrus was gathering an army for a campaign against the rebellious Pisidian mountaineers. The goal seemed plausible. Each soldier was promised a generous salary of 1 gold daric per month, which was significantly higher than the usual pay. Deception and money became the main incentives. Arriving in Sardis, Xenophon was impressed by the scale of what was happening. The army consisted of about 13,000 Greek hoplites and almost 100,000 barbarian warriors. The Greek contingent was commanded by experienced generals, among whom the stern Spartan Clearchus stood out. Among the commanders were also Xenophon's friend Proxenus and the cunning Thessalian Menon. Xenophon himself, holding no command position, was merely a curious observer in Proxenus's retinue, an aristocrat who, by a twist of fate, found himself at the center of momentous events. Finally, the huge army set out. It was a mesmerizing sight. The light infantry marched in front, followed by the indestructible Greek phalanx. In the center rode Cyrus himself with his guard, and a gigantic baggage train brought up the rear. The great march had begun. At first, the march proceeded through the familiar lands of Asia Minor without major difficulties. However, the army moved further and further east, and the Greeks began to grow suspicious. They had long passed Pisidia, but Cyrus showed no signs of turning on the mountaineers. The soldiers realized they had been deceived. The grumbling among the soldiers grew louder. They realized they were being led not against wild tribes, but against the great king, to Babylon. The scale of the campaign and its direction left no doubt. The true purpose of the march, which Cyrus had so carefully concealed, became obvious to everyone. In the city of Tarsus in Cilicia, this realization led to open mutiny. The Greeks flatly refused to go any further. They had not been hired to fight against the powerful Persian monarch and considered the campaign suicidal. They demanded their pay and an immediate return home. The army was in revolt. Cyrus's entire plan was on the verge of collapse, and in this critical situation, he showed himself to be a brilliant leader and psychologist. He did not threaten the Greeks or use force. Understanding it would be useless. He decided to act with cunning. First, he gathered the Greeks and gave a speech full of feigned despair. He claimed that he too had been deceived, and his real goal was to take revenge on a personal enemy, the satrap Tissaphernes, who was supposedly somewhere ahead. But this trick did not work. Then Cyrus tried another tactic. He locked himself in his tent, feigning confusion, while his agents spread rumors among the Greeks about the dangers of the return journey. The Spartan Clearchus, likely in league with Cyrus, played along, pretending to persuade the Greeks to stay. The decisive argument was money. At the end of this psychological game, Cyrus came out to the Greeks and promised to increase their pay by 1.5 times. This argument, reinforced by the fear of the dangers of the return journey, worked. Reluctantly, the Greeks agreed to continue the march. After this, the army crossed a narrow mountain pass, the Cilician Gates. Here, in the city of Myrandris, 2 Greek commanders, Xenias and Passion, frightened of the consequences, deserted, putting their troops on ships and sailing home. This was a new challenge for Cyrus. Everyone expected his anger, but he again acted wisely. He announced that he would not pursue the fugitives, stating that he valued only voluntary service. He said that those who served him of their own free will would find a better friend in him than those who left him. He showed magnanimity. This magnanimous speech finally won the hearts of the Greeks. They realized they were serving not a typical Eastern despot, but a man of honor. Near the city of Thapsacus, after crossing the Euphrates River, Cyrus finally officially announced the true purpose of the campaign: to overthrow his brother and seize the Persian throne. He promised each soldier, in addition to his pay, a huge reward in case of victory. Enthusiasm, fueled by promises and personal loyalty to Cyrus, swept through the army. Now they were not just mercenaries, but comrades in a great cause. After crossing the river, they entered the very heart of the enemy empire. The way back was cut off. Ahead of them lay a decisive battle that would determine not only the fate of the Persian throne, but also their own lives. The battle was inevitable. After the crossing, Cyrus's army moved south along the Euphrates. They marched through the scorched Mesopotamian plain, suffering from heat and lack of water. scouts reported the gathering of a huge royal army, but the enemy was nowhere in sight, which only increased the nervous tension. Finally, in early September of 401 BC, near a place called Cunaxa, the armies met. The sight was terrifying. The king's army, by various estimates, numbered from 400,000 to 1,000,000 soldiers. Artaxerxes' forces vastly outnumbered the rebel army. The king's army stretched across the plain, their armor glittering. The scythed chariots, heavy wagons with long blades on their axles, designed to cut through dense infantry ranks, caused particular alarm among the Greeks. It was a fearsome psychological weapon. Cyrus quickly arranged his army. He placed his main strike force, the Greek mercenaries under Clearchus, on the right flank, anchored by the river. He himself, with a detachment of 600 cavalry bodyguards, took a position in the center, opposite his brother Artaxerxes' supposed location. Before the battle, Cyrus, accompanied by Xenophon, rode along the Greek ranks. He wore no helmet, so that the soldiers could see his face. He reminded them of the reward, and said that their freedom and valor were worth more than the countless hordes of his brother's slaves. He inspired his men for the decisive fight. He ordered Clearchus to attack the center of the Persian army, where the king was, understanding that this would decide the outcome. However, the Spartan, experienced but overly cautious, disobeyed. He feared that if he detached his flank from the river, he would be surrounded. It was a fatal tactical error. Instead of attacking the center, Clearchus led the Greeks straight ahead. They advanced in silence. At arrow's range, they raised their war cry, struck their spears against their shields, and broke into a run. This menacing charge had a stunning effect on the Persians facing them. Unable to withstand the sight of the charging phalanx, the barbarians faltered and fled in panic, without even joining the fight. The scythed chariots proved ineffective. The hoplites simply parted to let them pass. The right flank of the royal army was completely routed with minimal losses for the Greeks. Carried away by the pursuit, the Greeks pushed far ahead, believing the battle was won. But the decisive events were actually unfolding in the center. Cyrus, seeing the enemy outflanking his left wing and spotting his brother in the distance, made a desperate and fatal decision. Consumed by rage and a desire to personally decide the battle's outcome, he charged with his small bodyguard detachment directly at the king. His assault was so swift that he broke through the guard and engaged in a duel with his brother, Artaxerxes. He managed to wound his brother in the chest with a javelin. Victory seemed close. But at that moment, one of the king's soldiers threw a javelin that struck Cyrus below the eye. The rebel prince fell dead. A desperate fight erupted around his body, in which all his loyal bodyguards perished. Cyrus's head and right hand were cut off and mounted on a spear as a sign of the king's complete victory. The rebellion was over. Returning from their pursuit, the Greeks were astonished to find that, having brilliantly won their own fight, they had lost the war. Their employer was dead. They were alone in the heart of an enemy empire. The sunset over the field at Cunaxa was the sunset of the life and ambitions of Cyrus the Younger. But for Xenophon and his 10,000 comrades, this was only the beginning. The beginning of their own epic, a desperate march for survival that would go down in history as the Anabasis, the ascent. Cyrus's death threw the Greeks into shock and confusion. They had achieved a brilliant tactical victory, but strategically, they were at a dead end. The Asian part of their army, upon learning of their leader's death, immediately retreated, abandoning the Greeks to their fate. They were left completely alone. That night, the Greeks returned to their camp. They didn't consider themselves defeated. After all, the enemy had fled the field. But the next day, they fully realized the desperation of their situation, trapped thousands of miles from home in the middle of a vast, hostile country. King Artaxerxes sent envoys with a humiliating demand: to lay down their arms and surrender to the mercy of the victor. Despite their hopeless situation, the Greeks answered with pride. Their commander, Clearchus, told the envoys that victors do not surrender their weapons. They refused to capitulate, declaring that they were ready to either serve the king on honorable terms or fight their way home. The Greeks entered into long and complex negotiations. The chief negotiator for the Persians was the cunning satrap Tissaphernes, the late Cyrus's old rival and a personal enemy of the Greeks. Feigning friendship, Tissaphernes arrived at their camp. He said he admired their valor and had persuaded the king to let them leave in peace. He promised them a truce, provisions, and guides all the way to the coast. The Greek commanders, especially Clearchus, were highly suspicious. They knew of Persian treachery, but there was no other way out. Attempting to fight their way through an entire empire without knowledge of the roads or provisions seemed suicidal. After long debates, they decided to accept Tissaphernes' offer. Oaths were sworn, and a truce was concluded. The Greek army, accompanied by Tissaphernes' forces, moved north along the Tigris River. The march took place in an atmosphere of growing distrust. The armies kept their distance, and minor skirmishes constantly broke out. The Greeks saw the Persians burning villages in their path, depriving them of food. Clearchus, seeing that the tension could escalate into open conflict, decided to take a risky step. He demanded a personal meeting with Tissaphernes to dispel suspicions and restore trust. The treacherous satrap gladly agreed. The trap was about to spring shut. At the meeting, Tissaphernes was all courtesy. He convinced Clearchus that certain slanderers were to blame for sowing discord between them. He proposed that all the Greek commanders, generals, and captains come to his camp for a conference, where he would point out the culprits, and they would punish them together. Despite warnings from more cautious officers, the stubborn and authoritarian Clearchus believed, or pretended to believe, Tissaphernes. Perhaps he thought his status as a Spartan would protect him from any treachery. He persuaded the other commanders to go with him. 5 generals, including Clearchus and Xenophon's friend Proxenus, and 20 captains, accompanied by a small escort, went to the Persian camp. The common soldiers were left to wait at the gate, while the entire command proceeded to Tissaphernes' tent. They were walking to their certain death. What happened next was an act of the greatest treachery. At a signal from Tissaphernes, the guards fell upon the unarmed commanders. The 5 generals were seized, put in chains, and sent to the king, where they were beheaded after being tortured. The 20 captains and all their accompanying soldiers were killed on the spot. A Greek deserter from the Persian army galloped into the Greek camp, where they were anxiously awaiting the commander's return. He brought the terrible news. The army had been decapitated. Its entire high command had been treacherously and mercilessly destroyed. There was no hope left. That night, absolute despair reigned in the Greek camp. It seemed to be the end. They were trapped, surrounded by enemies, without leaders, and without any hope of salvation. No one lit a fire. The soldiers simply lay on the ground, thinking of the homes and families they were never to see again. It was the darkest night of their expedition. a night when it seemed the morning would never come. Faith in the oaths sworn before the gods had been cynically trampled. But it was at this moment of total despair that a humble Athenian observer, who had previously stayed in the shadows, was destined to step onto the stage of history. Xenophon could not sleep either. He was devastated by the death of his friend Proxenus and fully aware of their hopeless situation. He was not a commander, but a private individual, and formally bore no responsibility for the army. He could have thought only of his own survival. The thought of a shameful death or slavery was unbearable to him. Dozing for a moment, he had a dream. A lightning bolt struck his father's house, and everything was illuminated. Waking up, he began to ponder this sign. The dream could mean death, but the light could also be a symbol of salvation from Zeus himself. And then a thought struck him. Why was he lying idle? The night was passing, and with the dawn, the enemy would come, bringing torture and a disgraceful death. Passive waiting was tantamount to suicide. He had to act immediately, without losing a minute. He asked himself, why is no one preparing to defend? Why is everyone waiting for someone else to lead them, someone more experienced or noble? This thought became a turning point for him. He realized he had to take the initiative himself. Getting up immediately, he found the captains from his late friend Proxenus's unit. He gathered them and delivered a fiery speech. Without hiding the dangers, he appealed to their courage and sense of self-worth, urging them not to give up. He reminded them that they were Hellenes and could not submit to barbarians. He told them that their only salvation lay in their own valor and discipline. He called for the immediate election of new commanders to replace the slain ones and to prepare for battle, to meet the morning fully armed. Xenophon's energy and confidence had an effect on the dispirited officers. They agreed with him and asked him to lead them. Inspired, they dispersed through the camp to gather all the surviving commanders for a general council. By midnight, about 100 men had assembled. The Spartan Chrysippus, the highest-ranking remaining officer, opened the meeting. After him, Xenophon took the floor. This was probably the most important speech of his life, upon which the fate of 10,000 men depended. Standing before the commanders, he presented their desperate situation not as a tragedy, but as a challenge. The Persians' treachery, he said, had freed them from all oaths and made them enemies by right. Now they could act without regard for a truce that no longer existed. He instilled confidence in them, proving their moral and military superiority. The Persians had resorted to vile murder because they were afraid to fight them in open combat. The Greeks were better armed, more disciplined, and fighting for their lives, while the Persians were slaves fighting for a master. He proposed a concrete plan. First, immediately elect new commanders. Second, burn everything superfluous, tents, wagons, to increase mobility. Third, develop a new marching tactic in a hollow square formation to repel attacks from all sides. Xenophon's speech was logical, passionate, and most importantly, it gave hope. The soldiers, who had just been in a state of shock, felt a surge of strength. All his proposals were unanimously approved. Immediately, right there at the council, new commanders were elected. In place of the Spartan Clearchus, another Spartan, Chrysophus, was elected chief general, and in place of the fallen Proxenus, Xenophon was chosen as commander of his unit. Thus, in one night, the Athenian philosopher-observer became one of the main leaders of a 10,000-strong army. The dormant talent of a commander, organizer, and orator awoke in him. Unlike the experienced but straightforward Clearchus, he had a flexible mind and a capacity for unconventional solutions. And the lessons of Socrates had taught him to deeply understand human psychology and find the right words for the soldiers. That night, in the very heart of the Persian Empire, surrounded by enemies, the Greek army found a new leader. A leader who would guide them through unimaginable trials to the north, to the distant and saving sea. The army had found hope. With the first rays of dawn, the camp was transformed. Instead of despair, there was bustling activity everywhere. Huge bonfires of tents and wagons became a symbol of their resolve. The soldiers were burning the past, preparing for a desperate march for survival. They were ready for any ordeal. The army, numbering about 10,000 men, formed a hollow square bristling with spears. In the center was the baggage train with provisions. As soon as they set out, they were immediately attacked by Persian cavalry and archers. The march began with a battle. The Persians did not engage in close combat. They showered the Greeks with arrows and javelins from a safe distance, wearing them down and inflicting casualties. The Greeks had almost no archers or cavalry and could do nothing about it. It became clear they would not get far this way. On the very first day, it was clear the march would be slow and bloody. That night, Xenophon again showed his tactical ingenuity, proposing the immediate creation of special units to counter the enemy. A detachment of Rhodians, skilled slingers, was formed, who could hurl stones farther than the Persian arrows could fly. From the few available horses, a small but effective cavalry unit of 50 horsemen was created. He had found an asymmetric answer to the threat. These measures brought immediate results. The next day, the Persians were met with a hail of stones and a surprise attack by the Greek cavalry. Having suffered losses, the enemy archers were forced to keep a more respectful distance, which greatly eased the march. The army moved north, up the Tigris River, towards the mountains of the Carduchians, in what is now Kurdistan. They successfully repelled Persian attacks, but a new, even more terrible ordeal awaited them. The worst was yet to come. Their path was blocked by wild and inaccessible mountains. This land was inhabited by the fierce and warlike Carduchian people. These mountaineers had never submitted to the Persian king and considered their land inviolable. A new, more dangerous enemy had appeared. The 7-day crossing through the Carduchian mountains turned into a real nightmare. This guerrilla war cost the Greeks more casualties than all the battles with the Persians. The Carduchians, masters of ambush, rolled huge rocks down on them and showered them with arrows from unreachable heights. The Greeks had to fight for every high ground. Xenophon, commanding the rearguard, was constantly in the thick of the action. In these battles, he showed not only personal bravery, but also an extraordinary talent for tactical tricks, outflanking the enemy and catching them by surprise. Finally, bleeding, the Greeks broke through the mountains and reached the plains of Armenia. But here, a new, even more merciless enemy awaited them: a harsh winter. They found themselves on a high plateau, covered in deep snow and facing bitter frosts. The soldiers, in their light Greek clothing, suffered terribly from the cold. Many had no shoes. Frostbite and snow blindness set in. The icy wind, according to Xenophon, seemed to strip the skin. The physical suffering was unbearable. To the cold was added hunger. The local villages were poor, and the inhabitants hid their supplies. The Greeks often had to spend the night directly in the snow. Many collapsed from exhaustion and froze to death. The army's morale, so painstakingly raised by Xenophon, was again at a low ebb. At one critical moment, when straggling soldiers refused to go on, preferring to freeze to death, Xenophon had to resort to extreme measures. He ordered the exhausted men to be forcibly lifted, understanding that any stop meant certain death. Despite all difficulties, the army stubbornly continued its agonizing journey north. They crossed the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, fought with local tribes, and hired guides who often deceived them. They moved slowly but steadily towards their goal, the coast of the Black Sea. In those terrible days, Xenophon was the soul of the army. He walked on foot, shared all the hardships with the soldiers, helped the tired, and found words of encouragement for the dispirited. His personal example and unbending will prevented the army from completely falling apart. This torturous passage through mountains and snow became the greatest test for the 10,000. That they were able to endure it and not lose their combat effectiveness was a true miracle, possible only thanks to iron discipline and outstanding leadership. After the Armenian highlands, the army fought its way through the lands of several warlike tribes. Finally, exhausted, they reached the large and wealthy city of Gymnias, whose ruler greeted them with surprising friendliness. The final obstacles had been overcome. The ruler of Gymnias, wanting to use the Greeks in a war against his neighbors, gave them a guide. He swore that in 5 days he would lead them to a place from where they could see the sea. For the exhausted army, this promise sounded like news of swift and certain salvation. The promise of seeing the sea breathed new life into the soldiers. For the Greeks, a nation of seafarers, the sea was synonymous with home, freedom, and safety. It was the very goal that had led them through all the inhuman suffering, and now it was very close. The guide led the army. On the 5th day, as promised, they ascended a high mountain called Theches. The vanguard reached the summit first, and the rearguard, where Xenophon was, prepared for the ascent. Suddenly, a loud shout came from the summit. Xenophon and his officers initially thought it was an attack and rushed to help. But as they got closer, they realized there was no fear or anger in the cry. It was a cry of pure, unbridled joy. When Xenophon climbed to the summit, he saw an unforgettable sight. Stern, battle-hardened veterans were weeping, embracing, and falling to their knees. They were pointing north, where a blue strip glistened on the horizon, and they were all shouting one long-awaited word: "Thalata! Thalata! The sea! The sea!" This cry became the emotional climax of the entire expedition. In it, relief, joy, and hope merged. The men who had traveled thousands of miles through enemy territory, lost comrades, and died of hunger and cold, finally had proof that their suffering had not been in vain. They had made it. As a sign of gratitude to the gods, the soldiers built a huge mound of stones on the mountaintop. From there, they descended, and after passing through the lands of the Macrones and the legendary Colchis, the land of the Golden Fleece, they approached their goal. The Colchians met them with hostility, but the Greeks, inspired by the proximity of salvation, easily dislodged them from their positions. Finally, they reached the coast of the Euxine Sea, at the Greek colony city of Trapezus, in the territory of modern-day Trabzon. They had reached the Greek world. Their arrival in Trapezus was a true celebration. The city's inhabitants, their fellow countrymen, welcomed the 10,000 warmly. After staying in the city for about a month, the Greeks celebrated their salvation. They held grand athletic games and offered generous sacrifices to the gods, fulfilling the vows they had made in their hours of despair. It seemed the worst was over, but the problems were just beginning. The army was still far from home. They had no money and no ships to transport 10,000 men. Deprived of a single goal, the army began to disintegrate. Discord arose, and the discipline that had saved them in the mountains began to rapidly decline. They ceased to be a single organism and turned into an unruly mob of armed men. The Spartan navarch Anabasis, who commanded the fleet in the region, promised them help but deceived them. He only sought to move the troublesome army away from the prosperous Greek colonies. The army slowly moved west along the coast. This journey was marked by conflicts and plunder. The exhausted soldiers, who were not being paid, increasingly resorted to force to obtain provisions. The heroes of the campaign were turning into a band of marauders before their very eyes. Several times the army even split into parts that acted independently, leading to senseless losses. Xenophon and other commanders made enormous efforts to maintain unity and discipline, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Finally, the remnants of the army reached Thrace, on the European coast. Here they received an unexpected offer. A local Thracian king, Xenophon II, offered them service to reclaim his lost territories, promising generous pay. The exhausted and impoverished soldiers gladly accepted. Xenophon, although eager to return home, stayed with the army, feeling a responsibility for his soldiers. He once again put their welfare above his own interests. The service with Xenophon was short, but successful. In 2 winter months, the Greeks helped him defeat his enemies. However, the king proved treacherous and refused to pay. The Greeks once again had to forcibly take what was rightfully theirs. They had been deceived again. And at that moment, a new, much more reliable opportunity arose. Sparta, having become the hegemon of Greece, had begun a war with Persia. The Spartans needed experienced warriors who knew Persian methods of warfare. The army of the 10,000 was an invaluable gift to them. Spartan emissaries arrived in Thrace and offered the Greeks a place in their army. For the soldiers, this was the ideal solution. Service under the mighty Sparta guaranteed regular pay, honor, and finally, an end to their endless wanderings. In the spring of 399 BC, Xenophon officially handed over command of the approximately 6,000 remaining soldiers to the Spartan commander Thebron. The Great March, which had lasted nearly 2 years, was officially over. Xenophon himself also entered the service of the Spartans. He soon became a close friend and advisor to the outstanding Spartan king and general Agesilaus. In him, he found the embodiment of all the qualities of an ideal leader: courage, moderation, wisdom, and care for his soldiers. He participated in Agesilaus's successful Asian campaigns against the Persians. However, this service had fateful consequences for him. A new war, the Corinthian War, broke out in Greece. Sparta's former allies, including Xenophon's native Athens, united against it. In 394, at the decisive Battle of Cunaxa, the Spartans fought against the coalition army. Xenophon, an Athenian citizen, fought in the Spartan ranks against his own countrymen. The Athenians considered this act high treason. The Athenian assembly passed a harsh sentence in absentia. Xenophon was condemned to permanent exile, and all his property at home was confiscated. He had become an enemy of his native city. By a bitter irony of fate, the man who dreamed of returning home a hero was cut off from his homeland forever. The great march that should have brought him glory and honor ultimately made him an exile. For him, it was a personal tragedy. But perhaps it was this event that gave world literature one of its greatest authors. Deprived of his homeland, Xenophon gained the time and peace to reflect on his unique experience and record it for posterity. In gratitude for his loyal service, the Spartans showed him great favor. They gave him a rich estate in Sicily, near Olympia. Here, for Xenophon, began the longest and perhaps happiest period of his life, lasting about 20 years. The estate was picturesque and fertile. Here Xenophon could realize the dream of any Greek aristocrat, to live the life of a free landowner in complete harmony with nature, far from wars and political intrigues. He found peace. With his own funds, he built a small, elegant temple dedicated to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Every year, he held a great festival in her honor, to which all the local residents gathered, and he generously treated them to game and wine from his estate. In Sicily, he led the idealized life he would later describe in his treatise, Economicus. He engaged in agriculture, hunted, and broke horses. Here he married and had 2 sons, whom he raised in the best aristocratic traditions. But his main occupation during these years was literary work. In the quiet of his estate, he could finally reflect on and write down everything he had witnessed. He took up the pen to defend the memory of his teacher, glorify the feat of his comrades, and pass on his experience to posterity. The main work of his life, without a doubt, was the Anabasis, the Ascent. It is a detailed account of the expedition of the 10,000, a unique work that became a fusion of several genres and immortalized his name. It is at once a thrilling military memoir, a priceless ethnographic source on unknown peoples, and a deep psychological study of human behavior in extreme conditions. But above all, it is an apologia for Xenophon himself and a hymn to Greek valor and discipline. Although he modestly wrote the book in the third person, he created in it a vivid and convincing image of the ideal leader, wise, brave, caring, and pious. In effect, he created a monument to himself and his ideas about leadership. In Sicily, he also wrote his Socratic works. In Memorabilia, he created a portrait of his teacher as a practical man, emphasizing his wisdom and usefulness to the state, seeking to refute the unjust accusations that led to his execution. Inspired by his friend, King Agesilaus, and reflecting on the ideal ruler, he created the Cyropaedia, the education of Cyrus. This work can be called the first political and educational novel in history. In it, using the example of the founder of Persia, Cyrus the Great, he paints a picture of an ideal monarch, wise and just. In addition, his pen produced the historical work Hellenica, continuing the narrative of the great Thucydides, as well as a number of small treatises on practical topics, on the duties of a cavalry commander, on horsemanship, on hunting, and on economics. This peaceful period ended in 371. After the Thebans crushed the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra, ending their hegemony, Xenophon, as a friend of Sparta, had to leave his estate. He moved to Corinth, once again becoming an exile. Around the same time, Athens, needing an alliance with Sparta against the rising power of Thebes, repealed the decree of his exile. He could once again return to his homeland. But apparently, he never took advantage of this opportunity, living out the rest of his days in Corinth. His sons, raised in the Spartan tradition, ironically fought in the ranks of the Athenian cavalry at the Battle of Mantinea in 362. In this battle, his eldest son Gryllus was killed. Legend has it that upon receiving the news of his son's death, Xenophon, who was preparing for a sacrifice, simply removed the wreath from his head and asked if he had died bravely. Hearing an affirmative answer, he placed the wreath back on his head, saying that he knew he had fathered a mortal. Xenophon died around 354 BC, having lived a long and incredibly eventful life. He was an Athenian cavalryman, a student of Socrates, a soldier of fortune, a leader, an exile, and a writer. His legacy proved more durable than the empires whose rise and fall he witnessed. The story of Xenophon is a mirror reflecting an entire era: the crisis of the Greek polis, the end of Athens' golden age, and the great clash between the Hellenic world and the Persian Empire. He was both a product of his time and a personality who managed to transcend it. The uniqueness of Xenophon lies in the fact that his destiny equally combined two great forces of ancient life: action, praxis, and thought, logos. He was not only a man of action, but also a man of words, who managed to comprehend and immortalize his deeds. As a man of action, he lived a life that would suffice for several adventure novels. He was a leader who, at a moment of complete despair, took responsibility for 10,000 lives and saved them, leading them through unimaginable trials. His Anabasis became not just a story, but a practical textbook on military tactics and leadership in crisis situations. It is no coincidence that this book was studied by many great commanders, and Alexander the Great, setting out for the East, undoubtedly took Xenophon's experience into account. But the main lesson of the Anabasis was geopolitical. It clearly demonstrated to the Greek world that the vast Persian Empire, despite its riches, was a colossus with feet of clay. A small but disciplined detachment of Greeks could pass through it without meeting serious resistance. This lesson was not forgotten and largely predetermined the boldness and success of the future conquest of Asia. But the legacy of Xenophon, the writer, the man of thought, proved even more enduring. His books continue to live and speak to us across the millennia. He did not possess the philosophical depth of Plato, but his strength lay elsewhere, in clarity, practicality, and profound humanism. His writings gave us an alternative, more down-to-earth, and perhaps more authentic image of his teacher Socrates than the one we know from Plato's dialogues. His Cyropedia became the progenitor of a whole genre of mirrors for princes, and had a huge influence on political thought, from Antiquity to the Enlightenment. And his minor treatises give us an invaluable insight into the daily life and values of an ancient aristocrat. Assessments of Xenophon's personality and history have varied. He has been reproached for narcissism for the way he described his own role in the Anabasis. He has been accused of betraying Athens and of an excessive love for all things Spartan, so-called laconophilia. Indeed, Xenophon was a conservative and an aristocrat who did not accept the extremes of Athenian democracy. But behind these ideological preferences lay a deep humanism and a genuine interest in man, his motives, and his behavior. In his works, we see a profound interest in the human being. He describes with equal curiosity the valor of his comrades, the customs of wild tribes, the wisdom of Socrates, and the cunning of a Persian satrap. Throughout his life, he sought arete, excellence and virtue, both on the battlefield and in peaceful life. Xenophon remains in history as a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. He showed that even in the most desperate situation, one can maintain dignity and the will to live. His story is an eternal reminder that leadership is not a title, but a responsibility, and courage is the ability to act in spite of fear. The steel of Xenophon's sword has long since turned to dust, but his words proved more durable. They immortalized both himself and his 10,000 comrades, so that such stories of unbending will are not interrupted. Subscribe to our channel, give a like, and share your opinion in the comments. Your support helps us tell stories about the great.